Welcome to Broken Law, the podcast about the law, whose interests it serves and whose it does not. Brought to you by the American Constitution Society, a 501c3, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. I'm Lindsay Langholz, Senior Director of Policy and Program here at ECS. We are 1 year out from Election Day 2024. I mean, it's already started, but we're about to be in the thick of it. And we thought we would take today's episode to really get a look at what stories are developing, what we should be looking at in terms of our actual election system. We obviously saw in the wake of the 2020 election, the emergence of the big lie, the idea that the election was stolen despite zero evidence to actually prove such a claim. And we've seen that come through within our election administration and put pressure on that system. So we wanted to take a look at how the system's holding up and what we should be keeping an eye on going into a presidential election year. To help us do that, we have back on the podcast, Jessica Huseman. Jessica is the editorial director of VoteBeat, a nonprofit news organization reporting on elections and voting. Before helping to launch VoteBeat, Jessica was the lead elections reporter for ProPublica and helped manage the Election Land Project for 3 federal election cycles. So Jessica, welcome back to Broken Law.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, so excited to have you back. I can't think of anybody better to help us kind of understand what's important in the noise and what to kind of filter out. So what stories are you kind of keeping an eye on as we get into this presidential election year?
You know what? It's so interesting. I think that this is the time of the year, like the few months before the federal election year kicks off, where people start to believe that time is infinite and they're going to have
fine. We'll solve it later.
Yeah. They're going to have time to do whatever, and if you radically change elections, then gigantic counties will of course be able to accommodate all of that in the month.
Yeah.
And so I think the things that I'm paying attention to the most right now are we're seeing these. I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago, and I'm sure we'll keep writing about this, but we are seeing weird little pockets of let's hand count every single ballot across the country in really troubling ways. I think we're writing about it most in depth right now in Texas, but it's also taking place in places like Arizona. But, in a state like Texas, it can be pretty damaging because here, the parties technically run their own primaries, right? Mm-hmm. So most parties in most counties, unless it's really a really small county where there are not that many precincts, will contract out with the county to manage the elections for them. Like the Democrats and the Republicans will pool together. They'll use the same precincts. They, obviously their voters get different ballots, but more or less it operates like a normal election day, even though technically it's run by the parties. Well, because it is run by the parties in Texas, even places where they were not successful in getting their whole county commissioners court, which is sort of the county government here, to go for hand counting ballots, because really it's a crazy thing to do. They're like, okay, that's fine. We will do it for the Republican primary because we get to run those by ourselves, right?
All right.
And the Secretary of State in Texas has put out a 16-page guide that's we can't stop you from doing this, but for the love of God, please don't, which is really funny. And they're we're not going to and the state reimburses some money around election administration and primaries. And they're we're not reimbursing past this threshold. So you do whatever you want, but this is as much as we're in for. And so that's been really interesting to see. I think that's the thing that is most pressing to me because the primaries are obviously first in the order of operations.
And soon. I mean, we're coming up on them.
Right. And so we have really big counties like Dallas County, which is where I live, just decided last week not to do this for its Republican primary. And I don't know, going from Dallas County, you can vote anywhere in the county. That the same is true in the primaries as well. It's all vote centers. For very complicated reasons for hand counting, you couldn't use those. Everybody would have to go back to their precincts. The Republicans and the Democrats would be counting, would be not only counting ballots very differently, but administering an entire primary election in radically different ways. I can't think of anything more confusing. And so we might see this happen in I think much smaller counties, but the level of confusion I think will be similar. And that's troubling.
Well, remind us why people are wanting to do this hand count. What's motivating that pressure that they're putting on election administrators?
Yeah, I think that this is sort of a new evolution of the big lie, right? Stemming from this idea that you cannot trust voting machines for any reason at any time. This extends so far as to counting the ballots, right? So the vast majority, like a 95% of people who cast ballots in the United States ultimately do it on paper. So their ballot will be counted in its paper format, right? There are very, very few jurisdictions that are using all electronic votes. But this sort of brainworm has invaded through and to counting of the ballots, right? In a lot of places, counting a ballot is not different from like the Scantrons you saw your teachers using to grade pop quizzes or whatever, right? Like you send them through this rapid scanner, counts the ballots. If there's anything wrong, you can look at the actual ballot and go back and count it again. They don't even want that, right? And so like if you consider how much technology goes into counting an election, right? We're talking about ballot tabulатors, we're talking about scanners, we're talking about counting machines, all sorts of things. All of these in most states, and actually every state but Mississippi, have to be certified, right? And so you can't use technology that isn't certified. And because there is no structure for hand counting ballots, none of the technology you might think that you can use to hand count ballots, you can actually use. So like down to calculators.
Oh God, you're doing the little tick marks.
You have to do tick marks. You have to you can't use a program to Excel to sum up, if you've got 100 people all counting in the room, somebody better be really good at hand adding all of those batches together because you're not allowed to use a tallying software. And so this is what they think is going to be most secure, right? There, if we remove all of the technology, if it's just humans looking at this, then the count will be right every time. Of course, we know that is ridiculous, right? There are studies that show this. Humans are really bad at tedious, repetitive, boring tasks.
At math.
This is at math, right?
Yeah.
These are all psychological phenomena that we are well acquainted with in our own lives. And so it doesn't scale. It takes forever. And so it's going to be very costly. It's going to result in lost ballots. It's going to result in just an incredible infusion of constituent time into a system that ultimately won't become better as a result of it. And so that level of sort of exertion for nothing, right, is going to dissuade people from becoming active in the future in a way that I think is sort of unsettling. Mm-hmm.
And in the background of all of this, at least in 2020, I can't imagine that it will change, is the fact that we hit election night and the same people who are now calling for hand counts of ballots were like, stop counting.
Oh, yeah.
We need an answer on election night. And so this process both extends the actual counting, but at the same time, then it takes longer to actually get the results.
The same people who are like, oh, if it takes you longer than 2 seconds to count all of these ballots, then you're committing fraud, are the same people saying, okay, let's sit down and have all of our friends and neighbors come into this warehouse and count thousands of individual pieces of paper. It's a crazy premise. And I think if you interrogate it for even the smallest amount of time, pull back the tiniest little membrane at the top, you realize very quickly that it's just not workable in any way. But that does not mean that activists who are dead set on this are not causing absolute chaos in some of these counties. Kerr County, Texas, it's on its third election administrator in like a matter of weeks because they keep dropping out because of this. There's, Cochise County, Arizona, the elections director sued for like hostile workplace environment over this. They had to pay her like $130,000. Shasta County, California is just like vomiting money down the drain right now trying to do this, and the state is not going to let them. So it's really alarming. It is a level of sort of let's stick our head in the sand and pretend we're all better at math than we actually are is really shocking. Like I would encourage them to look at our standardized test scores before choosing this path forward. But
yeah, absolutely. You mentioned two different things that I think are broader topics too, which is, it's costing money and it's costing humans, people who are willing to do these jobs at a time where both are at low levels.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, I was talking to an election administrator in one of these counties in Texas that's undergoing this. And he was telling us that, in a good faith effort to show his constituents how impossible it is to hand count ballots, he, gathered his whole staff, and it took his entire staff 1 hour to count 32 ballots, right? So if you can just expand that out by several days, like the ballots in the United States have dozens, like actually dozens of options on them. And this was really fun. So I recently wrote a guest essay for the New York Times, which I really still can't believe that I'm saying out loud. Like
I can. You were an expert on these things.
It feels so fancy. But anyway.
Yes.
So I wrote this guest essay, and I was going through fact checks, and I said this as part of my piece, which is, you can hand count in like places like France, because first of all, it's like a much smaller country, but also because there's like one race on all of their ballots that you can sort of like, this goes here, let's count all the stacks at the end. This is very easy to do by hand count. In the United States, you've got actually dozens of options. And the fact checker for I said upwards of 60, which I was basing off of like actual sample ballots from 2020. And she was like, this seems too high to me. And I was like, actually, no, like, look at all of these ballots. And so when you think about hand counting, you're not just hand counting one race, you're hand counting every race, all of the write-ins, all of the ballot measures, all of the like municipal, county, state, federal, all of them, right? And for some of these things, you can count every ballot in the state, right? For some of these, it's only these like 13 precincts, right? So the level of organization and harm, like the level of organization you need and the amount of harm you can do by not following a standard organizational system in these like processes is really striking. Like we're talking about like actually disenfranchising people on the back end. And that's really shocking.
Yeah, absolutely. And it feels like part of the design, right? It's like, okay, if we can create some chaos and if we can create just kind of uncertainty about these systems, we get the result we want, is what it feels like from the outside.
Well, you know what? It's so interesting because I think that is often the way that these things play out. But I think the places that are most likely to hand count in this way are almost entirely Republican, right? So they're just hurting themselves, right? Mm-hmm. And so the counties where we've seen it go the farthest are places like Shasta County, California, which is just like bright red, baked in, has been for a long time. There might not even be a Democratic primary in a lot of these races, right? And so it's really Republicans choosing to do this to themselves. And the reason that we're seeing this is because, again, right, like we've discussed, this is a crazy idea. It's like completely insane thing to do. And so unless you have almost complete ideological agreement on whatever board would make this decision for your locality, like whether that's your township or your municipality or your county or your state, right? Like unless there is total ideological sameness, usually one person is like, guys, I don't think this is a great idea, right? And like, they're like, all right, I see what you mean, right? But we've seen, even in this like race for Speaker of the House, how much sort of ideological consistency has become part and parcel to a very specific section of the Republican Party. And so in states where that is popular and in counties where ideological diversity just doesn't exist, this is where that's happening. And so it will be interesting for me to see the ramifications of this 4 or 5 years down the line, because in traditional places where we could say like, oh, this was the intent, like it actually isn't the intent. Like these folks actually think that this is going to make counting super fast and super easy.
You mentioned states that have kind of become more hardline when it comes to election administration issues. It makes me think of Texas, good old Texas, and the way in which the state dealt with Harris County in particular and kind of imposed its will on a county that maybe wouldn't go along with certain ideas and just said, no, we're coming in and kind of bigfooting here. And are you seeing that as kind of a trend that has ticked up, or is that an unusual circumstance?
So that is it is an unprecedented circumstance, certainly, right? Like I think that we have like ventured into territory in which unprecedented and unexpected are not necessarily.
We're using it all the time now.
Yeah, we're just sort of like, and maybe they mean two different things now, and in a way where they used to like mean the same thing. But, I think Texas was such an interesting thing because after, so Texas's legislature only meets for 6 weeks every 2 years, right? And so this is not exactly a powerful body. And then you like layer that on top of the fact that Texas's voting laws were more or less not very expansive to begin with, right? Like the counties in Texas have a lot of power to administer elections in the way that they like because the state is not a powerful entity here. So in Dallas, you can vote anywhere you want, right? Like the same is not true in Collin County, right? Which is right next door. And so, there's that amount of sort of diversity there. But I think that more or less as much as the state could do to elections, they had already done prior to 2020. Like in Florida, you could roll back vote by mail quite significantly. You can do the same thing in Arizona, but in Texas, there is no vote by mail, right? Like you vote absentee or you're over the age of 65 or you don't vote by mail, right? That's it. And so there wasn't a ton to do, but one thing Texas could do that was much more aggressive was to essentially like usurp like county authority. And Texas has been doing that quite a lot, actually. And Harris County is a really good example of this, right? Like Harris County is the biggest county in the state. It is the bluest county in the state. They took over the school system a couple of years ago, right? So all of this stuff that you hear people like Greg Abbott or Dan Patrick, our governor and lieutenant governor, say about like local control is really just insane, because like as soon as a local government does something they don't want to do, they just take that control away. And so I think in that sense, like elections is just becoming the next frontier for that.
Well, and that feels true on a number of different fronts, right? Like election administration used to be this relatively low-key, nonpartisan issue, even though secretaries of state are often elected, but like it was generally not a thing that was part of the culture war.
No, it wasn't.
And it feels like this has really gotten sucked up into this like ideological battle in a really different way in the last couple of years.
I completely agree with that. And, it's so funny. I mean, it's not funny at all, actually. It's terrible. But like so I've been covering only election administration since just before the 2016 election. And so it's been a while. And when I first started, like in the run up to 2016, election administration was so different than it is now, right? Like Secretary of State was not as it is now, this like immediate jumping stone to governor, right? Like this was a sleepy bureaucratic position that like the nerds of state bureaucracy hung out and did, right? Like it's very different. And if you look at the people who were running elections, like it tended to be the same people doing it for many decades. It's not a particularly professionalized industry, right? Like there is actually only one certificate program in the whole country to become an election administrator. It's at the University of Minnesota.
Okay.
And everybody else was just like doing it by the seat of their pants, you know?
Yeah.
Like I recently met an election administrator in Georgia who until recently was the regional sales representative for Little Debbie. So
Okay.
like this, I know, I was like, I bet you understand logistics. You're good at this. So, you know, I mean, I think it was a very different kind of place. And now it's incredibly political, right?
Yeah.
People are getting threatened. People who want to do bigger and better, like better, quote unquote, elected positions are using this as sort of like a stepping stone to higher office, which means that they're like inherently politicizing the decisions that they're making and sort of like attracting a different audience of people as a result of that. So it's been a bit of an alarming shift over the past 6 or 8 years. Yeah.
You're listening to Broken Law, brought to you by the American Constitution Society. If you're enjoying Broken Law, consider becoming a member of ACS today. You do not need to be a lawyer to be a member. As we discuss so often on this podcast, our laws and legal systems impact all of us. By supporting ACS, you support Broken Law, our work to diversify the federal bench, and our advocacy for Supreme Court reform. You also become a member of our nationwide network. Learn more about ACS by visiting our website at acslaw.org. And now, back to the conversation.
It has been the subject of a lot of attention, a lot of litigation also. So I wanted to ask about what lawsuits are you keeping an eye on as we're 1 year out, kind of looking ahead to what could reshape the way that elections are administered in the next year?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I'm honestly pretty surprised at the positioning the Supreme Court has taken on recent Voting Rights Act cases coming out of like Louisiana and Alabama. Those have been really striking. I really thought that we would be on much different footing going into 2024, and especially Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in a way that we're not. And so I think that, you know, I don't usually get to say this on podcasts, but I think to the extent that anyone was convinced that Chief Justice Roberts was going to make it like the finale of his life's work to like unpackage the Voting Rights Act, like he's not done that. And so I think that's been really interesting for me to see, and it will be interesting for me to see sort of how much states like Alabama are going to push this up until they can't anymore, right? Texas, for example, and other states do this too, right? Like they just use, Ohio's great at this, right? They use unconstitutional maps for like multiple races before their county, like before the Supreme Court is like, oh no, you actually have to draw a new map now, right? And so I think even if we are seeing good decisions being made and like the ultimate decider, the path to get these fair maps is not a straight line. And so I think that we could see some at least intense confusion in those states, depending on how close to the line they choose to push it. And like that becomes an issue sort of every time there's a federal election cycle, right? There's this Purcell principle, right? Which is like, you know, can't change the rules too close to an election, but like what's too
unless
close?
We want to.
I don't know, yeah. Right? Like who knows?
Yeah.
And so it's like I feel like the Purcell principle like sort of gets suffocated every year, and they just push it closer and closer and closer to the election. And what that means, right, is that these election administration offices that are like underfunded and run by people who are not experienced at government or communication or public relations or voter education are trying to shove a really complicated voter education plan into, you know, a box of crackers that somebody opened 3 years ago. Like it's really frustrating to watch sort of these really dedicated election officials try and figure out what all of these rulings mean, right? Because it's all well and good for like people like me to flip open my computer and pontificate about this shit. But you know, they don't have that luxury of time. And we're talking about counties with pretty sizable populations that don't employ a county attorney, right?
Yeah.
Or like contract out with a county attorney that like really understands how to do contract negotiations, but like does not know how to divine meaning from legislative intent, right? And so we're putting these counties in these really terrible positions in terms of even just being able to defend their own choices in the months coming up to the election.
Yeah. And they're under such scrutiny now. Like it's only going to get worse, right? Like these used to be decisions that, you know, like small groups would kind of challenge or maybe try and push them one way or another. But now it's like such scrutiny on every choice they're making.
Absolutely. And you know, what's so interesting is that political science research suggests that like these laws honestly don't have a measurable impact on the electorate ultimately, right? Like there are lots of studies that show this. But the parties that are litigating these issues just like do not believe it, right? Like they're like, I don't care. This is the most important, craziest thing that's ever happened. And so they muddy the waters when the reality of, I think, like the impact would not be as heavy as they imagine it to be. So they're really, you know, I guess, you know, there's that like be the change you want or whatever, but they really are the change, right? Like if the litigation itself is playing, I think, a much bigger role in the politics of the thing than the ultimate consequences of the decisions that are being made. And so that's hard as a reporter or somebody who like watches this stuff to sort of think about and plan in the long term. Because even if this change never happens, or even if this, like, what will they gain through litigation that has nothing to do with policy, but has everything to do with turning out the base. These are all new questions that election administrators are trying to figure out how to navigate right now. And I don't envy them at all.
Oh my gosh, I don't either. I remember while they were dealing with how to even just get people to vote in a pandemic, which was its own gigantic cluster that nobody knew the answer to. I remember that there was a decision that came out from the court that basically like accidentally added a postmark rule to absentee ballots like 3 days before the election.
Yeah.
And I don't even think they meant to do it because it's like, okay, like y'all just kind of got to the result you wanted to get to and didn't even bother to make sure that this was actually like compliant with state law or like easy to administer.
And you know what? I think that people, especially like attorneys who like, I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest are like the, you know, modal person listening to this, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm not a lawyer, just so everybody knows. But, you know, I think that lawyers are often sort of astounded when I'm like, oh yeah, like the court ruled this, but actually has no basis in law whatsoever. And they're like, what? Like these are legal professionals. And I'm like, yeah, but you know what they're not professionals in? Election law, right? Like, you know, our story editor, Carrie Levine, was talking to somebody about this the other day, and I just thought it was so fascinating. And it's like a very valid point that I've not really thought about, right? Which is that, you know, 20 years ago when the 2000 election happened, most law schools did not have election law programs.
Oh, no.
Election law classes, right? Like this whole generation of lawyers that sort of like were fifth year associates in 2000, like Mark Elias, right? Are like running shit now. And that's not that long of a like trajectory for an entire sort of universe of legal thought to have been gestated in, right? Like we're all still arguing about like the edges of the Fourth Amendment, right? Like, you know, like we can't be dealing with this. And so we're like the people who know the most about election law are often like mid-level associates that are doing huge and like way beyond their legal abilities work that have massive civil rights implications, and then also come with it just like an incredible amount of complications in terms of like actual logistics. Like running an election from the back end is way more like being like in a sorting facility for UPS than it is like people like, like let's just
hanging chads and the
chads and just a little voting curtain. Like that is not at all what voting is. And so when you get courts coming in with this sort of like poorly developed legal philosophy, but then you also have to explain to the court this entire thing that they think that they understand because they have voted, right? Like the judges are no different than like your cousin at a party who thinks that he knows how the election is administered because he cast an absentee ballot once when he was in college, right? Like it's the same stuff. And so there's just so much, and I'm sure that this could describe like a number of areas of law, right? Like IT, we have this whole AI thing going on that's pretty crazy, right?
The court's just trying to figure out the internet right now as a bunch of older folks who don't.
The experts that you are bringing in to an artificial intelligence case are like people who have doctorates from MIT and teach there on a daily basis. The people we are bringing in as like election experts for how election county works were like a stay-at-home mom until 5 years ago when they decided to run for county clerk, right? Like these are two different spaces. And I think that in a lot of ways, the court just has not caught up with the intense partisanship that has sort of very suddenly taken this space over.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's such a good point because it's an area that all of a sudden got focused from a lot of different courts, and I don't mean courts as in like judicial courts, but just like different areas of our society where all of a sudden it's just huge amounts of attention drop on it. And everyone's an expert, but no one's an expert kind of, it's
right. Absolutely. Okay. And people on both sides, and I'm on both sides in this, I guess, but like, make these arguments that are like, that sound so reasonable and like sound like they shouldn't be controversial at all. Like, when Republicans are like, everybody should have an ID to vote, right? That doesn't sound crazy. And like polling suggests that most people agree with that, right? Mm-hmm. When you actually get down to like how states issue IDs and who does and does not have access to them as a result of that, and the type of information you need in order to obtain an ID, like these are all things that I think even reasonable Republicans know that they will eventually need to contend with, at least when they're the ones who sit down to write the law or consider the impact of the policy. But when they're talking about it, they don't either. Like they don't at all. And then, Democrats love to say things like, we should never close a polling place ever, not one time. But they don't like take a look at the historical usage data and like whether or not the 3 poll workers who processed 12 voters all day would be served better by the public by going to this much busier and under-resourced polling location across the county, right? There are so many things that seem like they should be simple fixes, like open more polling locations or give everybody an ID that are on, like, when you get down to it, just really not workable in terms of consistent policy from county to county to county and state to state to state.
Yeah. In a previous life, I did a lot of voter protection work. And so often people were surprised at like how few polling locations are ADA compliant because it's often like old churches or other buildings that just aren't. They don't have a way for disabled voters to get in easily. But then to talk about closing those polling locations, it's like, well, wait a minute. It's like, okay, but not everybody can access it.
Right. And, and I think that people think when they think about polling locations, they think about polling locations in urban areas or suburban areas that are like in schools or post offices or county government buildings, which are largely ADA compliant, right? But if you step outside of that for like even a second, right, there are swaths of the country that do not have any public buildings. And so instead of using the county administration building on the corner, you're using the local United Methodist Church that was built in 1885 and has like 13 stairs up the back, and you better be able to lift yourself up them. And that's it, right? Yeah. Or you're talking like my favorite polling location drama story ever was in LaSalle County, Texas, which is like quite south of it, like in the southern sort of portion of the state. And it's very rural. And in Texas, you have to have at least one polling location, and at least most counties have to have one polling location in every precinct. And so there was one precinct that had just been drawn. There was just a little bit of LaSalle County. There weren't any buildings in it at all, right? It was just houses and barns. And so they got an oil company to donate a trailer for use on election day. And they set it up. They had 2 poll workers from that area, which is also a state law, to administer the polls for that day. Those 2 people were the only 2 people that voted in that precinct.
They got to watch each other vote.
They got to watch each other vote and, and administer that election for themselves. And that is what they had to do. But the state was required to do that by law. And I guarantee you that trailer was not ADA compliant. So it's the Wild West out there.
And I think that's the point that I want to kind of draw out of all of this is so many of these decisions are important. They're important to voters, but to have them get sucked up into this political maelstrom is a nightmare for anybody who cares about just administering an election effectively, because it doesn't need to be. These are not things that need to be part of this wildfire that's going on in terms of discourse. And these poor election administrators are just doing their best to get things done the way that it has to get done. And they're dealing with pressure from all sides about things that really they have expertise in.
There are a lot of government functions that don't necessarily gather data in the same way that election administration does. But more or less, right, you've got polling locations, you've got a certain number of days for that voting to happen. You can take a look at this historical data, the usage of the polling sites. There are lots of states that are now tracking wait times. There's a ton of data that you can look at to make objective choices about what would benefit the most number of voters, or what suggest a path to move forward that will inconvenience or change the experience of as few people as possible. But even the interpretation of that data has been subjected to such ridiculousness over the past couple of years. The number of conversations I have sat through where people are debating the actual definition of words is really tedious. And, I think that there are very few other government functions that are as traditionally public facing as this one, right? You are going to cast a ballot. That is a direct thing that your government has to facilitate for you on the front end and the back end. Your taxes don't even work like that. This is a direct usage problem. And so I think when you mess with that, you really are messing with the foundational building blocks of democracy, which sounds very high-minded, but I don't mean it to be. I actually mean it's the simplest concept in the world, right? This is just what democracy is built of. And I think people make it too, instead of bricks, they think of beautiful crown molding that goes over all of our beautiful buildings we definitely have in this society, right? It's not, they think about sort of window dressing rather than building blocks that we just need to sustain ourselves.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I want to change topics a little bit, although I think it's pretty related. We've seen a lot of controversy over something else that used to be pretty non-controversial, and that is voter roll maintenance. I mean, there has been controversy over voter roll maintenance. There used to be a system called ERIC that was relatively non-controversial. It had people from all stripes in terms of state control in the system. And now all of a sudden that's become quite the political football.
Yes. And it's so interesting because I want to say the last number was 6. I think 6 states have left ERIC, which is the Electronic Registration Information Center.
As nondescript as you can make a name.
Yeah, they really wanted to call it ERIC, and that. So I mean, ERIC is this really fascinating thing, right? Your listeners might remember Chris Kobach's cross-check program that reared its head around 2016 and is no longer in existence, which was a very crude list matching situation. If anybody's ever done a VLOOKUP in Excel, like that is basically as complicated as this was. It just like sort of ran two states' voter rolls against each other. And if they got any matches, then they'd flag them, right? These are basically useless because like it is shocking how many people with your name are born on your date of birth. And so these false positives like pop all the time. There is a Jessica Huseman from Indiana that was born on my birthday, and I'm sure she hates me so much. I don't know.
Hey, Jessica, if you're listening.
Yeah, I'm like, hey, I'm sorry for ruining all of your SEO or something. She's like a fifth grade teacher, though. She probably doesn't care about
doing good work.
But like, this is what I mean, right? And so Eric did that same sort of thing, but they ran it against way more data points. So in order to participate in the program, you didn't just provide like your public facing voter roll, which does not have that much information in it. You also had to provide like your entire DMV database, the entire even non-public facing on the voter roll. So instead of matching on like first name, last name, and date of birth, they're matching on all of those things, and also former address, like email address, full social security number. Like this is a much more suggestive match, right? So if somebody moves out of state or they move within the state, right? These are the things that this voter roll matching program can detect, right? Dead voters. These are all the things that like Eric was pulling. In the last year, it's been sort of wrapped up in Gateway Pundit conspiracy land, where they've decided that it is this liberal plot to bloat voter rolls instead of cleaning them. Like there's actual data that shows that that's not true. And then one of their board members who has been outspoken, but nothing, but like all about things that, as we've talked about in this podcast, that didn't used to be particularly controversial.
Right. Yeah.
And so, I don't think that his messaging changed at all year on year, but I do think that like the reaction to it very much did. And so with these news articles, it became very sort of popular for states like Texas or Ohio or West Virginia or Virginia to pull out of Eric entirely. And what they'll find is that their voter rolls are just going to be messier like year over year. And all of these, like the states that used to participate in Eric are now doing really weird stuff to try to clean their voter rolls. And we saw this prior to the advent of Eric, which is like states would do aggressive things that were politically advantageous to make it look like they were cleaning their voter rolls and then just screw it up entirely. So like right now in Virginia, the governor's the governor's office has facilitated the removal of like 3,400 people from the rolls, but they're not all ineligible based on like their criminal convictions and the way that they thought they were a few years ago in Texas. The Department of Public Safety tried to help counties remove non-citizens and came up with actually thousands of people who were naturalized in like a recent year or whose name was just like Carlos Sanchez, like the other 40 Carlos Sanchez's that live in that city.
Right.
And so, it was really, really problematic. Florida has done similar sort of things like this. So when you attempt to do voter list maintenance in ways that are not standardized and that are not consistent, like month on month, year on year, you're going to make mistakes, right? Like any of the people that listen to this that have ever dealt with a government database know how messy it is, right? And so a lot of these matches or lack thereof have nothing to do with anything but sort of how messy the data is inherently. And so, a program like Eric was great because you were doing the same thing every time. There was a program that did it for you. It was dispassionate. It was automated. You were providing the same data every time. You were relying on the same quality of data from the other states that were also participating in the program. Now that states have removed themselves from that, their voter list maintenance is going to be like way more random. And so we're going to have these sort of one-off problems that county clerks, again, are going to be on the front lines of dealing with because the state is putting them in a position where they're like, oh yeah, list maintenance is easy. Just like look at this name and look at that name. They're the same name, right? And that's crazy.
Yeah. It feels like the common theme of all of this is like, we have the technology and the resources and the expertise to continue to make our elections better, but we're really just like sliding backwards.
We're devolving.
Because, we're devolving. That's exactly right.
It's
because it's become a political issue. It's like, okay, well, let's just unlearn the things that we've learned and make our system worse.
Yeah. And I think that what underlies a lot of this is a lack of understanding and a fear of technology and sort of this idea that Americans have these two totally competing ideas in their mind, which is that machines are hackable. Why can't I cast a ballot on the internet? These are two incompatible thought processes, but this is not the only thing that is flatly in contention with itself. And so, I think people both want to benefit from technology in ways that they associate in their mind with being if I can bank online, why can't I vote online? And they don't understand the sort of legal structure behind those two things, or the amount of fraud your bank can deal with through insurance, and the fact that your ballot's just not insured. So tough cookies, right? They're two different sort of ideas and thought process. But this is a lot of the people that I'm seeing who have these sort of really incompatible belief systems. It all comes back to I don't understand how technology works. And so maybe this goes away a little bit in the coming years as we get more tech savvy, but I'm sure we'll just come up with other problems for ourselves.
That sounds about right. That might be the lesson that we take. We're just going to keep shooting ourselves in the foot. We'll figure out which foot and with what weapon.
And if that one's already shot, just bring up the other one. Hold it in the air. Shoot it right in the toes.
Anything else that we haven't talked about that you want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on, or just things that you think are interesting as we're kind of getting into this period of ramping up?
Yes. This is something that I just say every time I'm anywhere, which is that I know that lawyers really love to do call centers for election day. These are valuable, especially if you live in a state in which these are under-resourced, and you your bar will be able to tell you if that describes your state. But honestly, go be a poll worker. I wish that more attorneys were just present in polling locations as poll workers and not observers. Because if you actually want to have an impact on the way that day goes and be able to serve as a witness in court later if something actually happens, you need to be a poll worker. Being an observer will only allow you limited access to the process. Whereas if you are a trained and sworn in poll worker, you're going to see so much more. You're going to have a much better understanding of the system. And so next year, or in the years after this, if you want to go back to doing the call center, having been a poll worker is going to be so valuable to that. And so, we talk a lot about how people are disenfranchised by these huge decisions or legislative actions. But the vast majority of people who get to the polls and can't cast a ballot on election day are unable to cast a ballot because they have had a negative interaction with a poll worker, because the poll worker didn't understand the rules, or because something went wrong that the poll worker didn't know how to fix. And so you can actually be much more impactful just by going and sitting at those polls all day.
You can prevent the fire from catching on instead of having to call the fire department because you're standing nearby with a phone.
You can be the lawyer in the back shouting about all of the things that the poll worker is doing wrong, or you can just go be the poll worker, right? And so, I think, and I think that's how we're going to fix this stuff. And that's how we're going to convince people what is good, but also crucially, what is bad about our system, because nobody knows anything about it. And so all of these really long conversations we're having about what works best and what doesn't work at all, right? Most people have not interacted with those systems in a way that would allow those conversations to be productive. Mm-hmm. So being a poll worker will get you there.
Love it so much. We will make sure to include a link in the show notes for folks to go to, that they can figure out how to become a poll worker. ACS has a pledge to become a poll worker, so you can sign the pledge and get all the information in one spot. Jessica, thank you so much. This has been incredibly helpful and informative. I've learned a lot. I really appreciate it so much.
I am so glad. This was really fun.
Oh, we'll have you back anytime. So thank you. And I want to thank our listeners for joining and listening in today. Make sure to follow and subscribe so that you don't miss an episode. Continue to like the show, share it with friends. Word of mouth is the way that we get more folks to tune into Broken Law. So we really appreciate everyone on that front. If you have ideas for future episodes, let us know. You can email us at podcast@acslaw.org or find us on social media at ACSLaw. Together, we will speak truth to power about the law, whose interests it really serves and whose it does not.